This week in the Regency, it's Regency Royals, and today we're looking at the Prince Regent. Our jumping off point is, in fact, technically outside the Regency. We're looking at an article from the London Packet and New Lloyd's Evening Post on the 28th of May, 1830. And this is leading into the point where George IV, who was the Prince Regent, is going to die soon. During this period, the papers reported on his health almost every day. The King's health. The following is a copy of the bulletin issued on Monday. Windsor Castle, which is where he was living at this point, and it's where he died, May 21st, 24th. The King's symptoms are still the same. His Majesty has passed a sleepless night. And the next bulletin, the King passed yesterday very uncomfortably, but His Majesty has had a good night and feels himself better this morning. Although technically the Regency ends in 1820 when George III dies and the Prince Regent is transformed into George IV, really, as a kind of feel, the Regency lives on at least until his death, and quite possibly until the death of his brother William IV and the beginning of the Victorian age in 1837. But we're looking here at some of the important parts of his life, in particular the relationships, because he had quite a few. I'm going to do another video later about his influence on fashion and style and architecture. But today we're just going to concentrate on Prinny the man. So he was George Augustus Frederick of the House of Hanover, born on the 12th of August, 1762. And this is where he was born. This morning, at 7:30, the Queen was happily delivered of a prince. Her Royal Highness, the Princess Dowager of Wales, several Lords of His Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council, and the ladies of Her Majesty's bedchamber being present. So everybody except the husband, everybody except the father was there. When there's a possibility of an heir being born, it has to be observed so that nobody can swap in a baby. This is my favourite bit of that report. Her Majesty's God be praised as well as possible in her present condition, and the young prince is in perfect health. The person that waited on the king with the news of Her Majesty's being delivered of a prince received a present of a £500 bank bill. That is an extraordinary amount of money. So, presumably he was very pleased that he'd had a son. Here we have some of the earliest portraits of him, and it's worth noting that that little boys, until they were what was called breeched, which means basically toilet trained. That's when they moved out of their frocks and into trousers. So although it looks like a little girl, that is actually Prinny. And then we have this rather charming portrait of the family. Queen Charlotte there looks a little tired, and who can blame her? She has 6 children already. She goes on to have 15. And Prinny's the one in kind of cherry red, orange. And here we have him with his favourite brother, Frederick, and who later died, unfortunately. And at first it's hard to figure out who's who, which one is more important. But if you look closely, you can see that although they're very much of a height, Prinny's foot is in front of his brother's foot, and that's there to show that he has precedence over him. So he grows up to be someone who looks like he belongs in a boy band. And really, that was the kind of feeling that the general population, particularly the young ladies, had towards him. So if you can imagine the kind of fervor of a fan for their favorite singer. That's how Prinny was considered at this age. And you can see why, he has a definite sense of style. We're not sure of the exact date of this, but he's somewhere between 18 and 20. And this is the age at which he leaves St. James and Buck House. He was born in St. James Palace, as all heirs to the throne had been until then. And the family lived in Buckingham House. But at this point, he decided he needed his own place. And so they gave him Carlton House. They bought it for him. And he completely renovated it. And it cost a lot of money, as most of the things that he did. This is an inside after the renovation. You can see there's a lot of gold leaf being used and rather sumptuous velvet hangings and so on. And this brings us to probably the single most consistent quality that he had. He spent an enormous amount of money. When he moved out of his parents' house into his own palace, the king gave him an allowance of £50,000 per year. Now that's about £9 million now. The Parliament also gave him a grant of £60,000 to renovate Carlton House because they recognised that it was not in a state that was fit for the prince, the Prince of Wales, as he was then. But, he went through that like water. He was spending at this time more than £30,000 a year on his horses. So the royal family still has an interest in racing and racehorses and so on. And it certainly goes back a long way. Prinny was big into racing, but also into driving. He was quite a good whip at this stage. And he spent a lot of money on racehorses, training horses, buying horses, breeding horses, huge amount of money. So that £50,000 didn't go very far. And he was always in debt, like always in debt. Now, he was a romantic hero at this point, and we can understand why. But oddly enough, he did not fall in love with one of the very pretty titled women that he was around at the time. He fell in love with this woman, Mary Ann Fitzherbert. And she was a widow already. She was quite young. She's only in her 20s. But she had been widowed twice over, so not a particularly lucky young woman. And he fell in love with her, and she fell in love with him, and there were two main problems to getting married. And he did want to marry her, and she definitely wanted to marry him. But there were two problems. One was the Act of Settlement in the 1700s. Had stated that no heir to the throne or king could marry a Catholic. And that's after that whole James III thing. And she was Catholic, she was Irish, and an Irish Catholic. The second was that because the king didn't really trust his son to pick the right wife, he had passed a law saying that the heir to the throne had to get the king's permission to marry, and that any marriage conducted without that permission was illegal. And then the third strike, of course, was that she wasn't noble. So it's a morganatic marriage, which means someone of high status marrying someone of low status, essentially. But nonetheless, they went ahead in 1785. So by this stage, he's 23. So perhaps not fully mature. And certainly at the time, people thought that she had finagled him into it. but because she was obviously more experienced than he, having been married and widowed twice. However, it does seem to have been a love match. She goes through a form of marriage with her, like he's actually married privately and secretly to her. But of course, it's not legal. And not only is it not legal because of the Act of Settlement and the King's law about getting his permission, it's also not legal because under the Marriage Act of 1753, you have to get married in a church, Church of England church, and they weren't. So, nonetheless, while Carlton House is being renovated, he goes off and lives with her in her house in London. And that relationship lasted for quite a long time. And we're going to circle back to it at the end of his life. But the papers had a field day. They went off to, there was a big storm in England, as you can imagine, about this when it came out. And they went off to Europe. And this is a caricature, one of those satirical pieces that James Gilroy was so good at. However, they didn't last long in terms of being happy together. And in 1787, he denied that he'd been married to her. The Parliament put quite a lot of pressure on him. And in the end, he came out and said, no, we weren't married. Why? Well, he was broke again. He'd spent all that £60,000 on Carlton House. He'd spent all the money that the king had given him. He'd run up enormous debts. And they said, just make it clear she's not your wife and we'll pay them off. So he did. So just imagine Maria. I mean, it must have been awful because she clearly did care for him. I mean, there's no doubt about that. She did care for him, but at this point, the relationship not unnaturally broke down. And he lived in Carlton House from then on. So here he is at the age of 30, still quite attractive. And this is 1792. We're still powdering the hair. His hair isn't actually that color. It's quite dark. He's still, the romantic prince. And he certainly made the most of it. We don't know how many mistresses he had, but he had the most well-known of them, the ones that lasted longer than a month or so. Mary Robinson, who was an actress, Grace Elliott, who was actually married. She was the wife of a doctor. Frances Villiers, Countess of Jersey, and she stayed around for quite a long time, kind of on and off. And she was one of the patronesses of Almack's. The Marchioness of Hertford and the Marchioness Conyngham. Those are just kind of the best known ones, but we know that he had possibly up to 36 illegitimate children. So there were a lot. And of course, that increased every time he had an illegitimate child, he had to look after them. And so that increased his costs significantly over time. Here is another satirical piece by James Gilroy with Prinny in the middle looking like a mooncalf. Charles Fox is the one in red. He's at this point the Prime Minister, and that's Mary Robinson. So people knew about these affairs and made fun of them, or maybe they liked them in the same way that we follow celebrity relationships now. People followed his. In some ways, I think Prinny is the kind of prototype celebrity. Eyes were on him from birth, obviously, but he lived one of those big celebrity lives, too much money, too much sex, too much drinking, too much eating. And everything he did was reported in newspapers and turned into the kind of satirical drawings that James Gilroy followed him through his whole life. There's a lot to have a look at if you're interested. But people were getting a bit upset about the fact he didn't have an heir at this point. And so we have a royal marriage, which he did agree to. there was some reluctance on his part, and he still, was going back to Maria every so often. And I suspect a part of him really thought he was married still. But anyway, he agreed to it. And why? Because he was broke again. And they offered to pay off his debts if he got married. And so they went and they found Caroline of Brunswick. She was 27, a little bit younger than him. It's not a very flattering portrait of her. There are better ones. Um, and she had had a really odd life. And I'm going to be talking about Caroline next month. She is an absolutely fascinating character in all kinds of ways, but she was a terrible wife and queen. Although being married to Prinny, really couldn't have been that much fun. But this April 1797 is when they get married. So he's 35, and she does look a bit browned off there. She clearly jumped at the chance to get to England to get away from her incredibly controlling family, which I'll talk about next month. I love this portrait of her, though. She looks like a modern woman. You could have that portrait come forward 100 years and it would still seem perfectly reasonable. And that, I think, is partly her character and showing through, her personality showing through. So Caroline, there's a whole story about Caroline. But the most important thing is that according to him, according to Prinny, they only had sex 3 times. He was disgusted by her. She was disgusted by him. We don't know why. And I'll talk about some of the rumors in the video about her, but they basically only had sex 3 times as far as we know. She got pregnant. She had her daughter, Princess Charlotte, named after her grandmother. And then they separated. She said, done my bit. This country's had queens before. There's no reason she can't take the throne. I'm not going near him again. And that relationship was incredibly acrimonious. He tried to divorce her a couple of times, failed because there were a lot of people on her side in Parliament. It was a huge, huge scandal. Remembering that you can't get nobody can get a divorce at this time without an act of Parliament. And so ordinary people didn't get divorces at all. You had to have connections in order to get the act through. But he claimed that she was unfaithful to him. And contemporary evidence suggests that she was quite a lot. But she ended up going off to live in Europe. And died a year after he did in 1831. There's no doubt it was the most unhappy marriage that you could have had. They hated each other. And we don't actually know why. We know why Prinny got upset with her later on when she was not acting as a dutiful wife should. But we don't know why they hated each other basically on first sight. So who knows? Possibly because there were rumors around that she wasn't a virgin, and possibly he found that out on the first night and thought it was disgusting. Who knows? Maybe he just didn't like her. But anyway, it was doomed, absolutely doomed from the beginning. And so he went back to having mistresses, and she was living in Europe. She wasn't even in London for much of his reign as king. She came back. He didn't want her to be crowned queen consort, but she was. She came back to coronation, but they didn't live together from then on. And so we come back to the time when he's ill and dying. And this is where Maria comes back. So this is what they looked like at the time they got together. And then we go forward 30 odd years. And we have 40 years actually, and we have him dying. She writes him a letter. And at this point, he's barely conscious, he's barely kind of making sense of the world. And he reads that letter, and then he puts it under his pillow, and it stays there until he dies. And he gives instructions that he be buried with her portrait, a little miniature of this portrait. And so he is put into his coffin with a picture of Maria over his heart. So in the end, perhaps there really was only one love of his life. And if he'd been allowed to marry her, his whole conduct might have been different. Who knows? But the fact that there was something really there, I think, is undeniable given the lengths that he went to. He died on the 26th of June, 1830. He was 67. So what did he die of? Well, basically, he died of eating too much and drinking too much. I mean, he had lost sight in one eye, which suggests diabetes. They're called dropsy, which is the fluid building up. He had a tumor on his bladder. He had calcified heart. So all of the things that one would expect of a man who weighed almost 300 pounds. And who, even in his last illness, was still eating and drinking enormous amounts. So what we can say of George IV is that he was a man of appetite. The Prince Regent, whether as the Prince of Wales, the Prince Regent, or George IV, he knew what he liked, and when he liked something, he liked a lot of it, whether that was food or drink or women. Towards the end, people made a lot of fun of his size, but he became quite religious towards the end. And he said he hoped that he would be forgiven because he'd always tried to do his best for his people. And certainly he was involved in politics more than his father was, and which is something I will talk about in a later video when I talk about his more public life. But for this one, the life and death of George, the Prince Regent, George IV, it was a life of excess. And that's what he died of. Well, that's this week in the Regency. I'm Elizabeth Leyden. I'll see you next week in the Regency.